My full names are Sharon Njobo, but for a good part of my journalism life, I was using my maiden name, which was Sharon Mlambo. I'm currently based in Toronto. I've been here for 17 years after leaving Zimbabwe in 2000 and briefly living in the USA for 5 years. While working as a journalist, I worked with the National News Agency, Ziana, and when I left, I was a senior business reporter at the time. I have transitioned somewhat to go into international development, and I work for an international development agency as a program manager managing global health projects. I also do a lot of community work within the Zimbabwean community here in Canada, where I work with women.
Yes, thank you. So, tell us a bit about your experience as a journalist in Zimbabwe. What difficulties you're facing there?
One of my most vivid memories of working as a journalist in Zimbabwe is what ultimately led to my leaving the organization that I was working for. I remember that I worked as a senior business reporter, and part of my responsibilities included traveling on state visits with His Excellency at the time, President Robert Mugabe, and I had traveled with him on a trip to Kuwait, where Zimbabwe was going to negotiate for a credit facility to procure fuel. And that was unsuccessful. So I wrote about that. And obviously, the government was not pleased about it. And they made life difficult for the entire organization of Ziana. And it became uncomfortable for me and my colleagues at the time. And I took it upon myself to leave the organization so that the government could release funding, because they were actually holding on to funding for Ziana because Ziana was writing stories that did not align with the government mandate.
What other difficulties did you face as a Ziana reporter?
The challenges as well existed for me as a woman journalist. In that there would be harassment. There's that harassment that you experience as a woman working in a field that is predominantly perceived to be a field for men. And also some of the challenges that we experienced at Ziana was inadequate funding, which now when I reflect was not because there were challenges with the budget or fiscus, but it was probably intentional on government's part to keep us underfunded. And as well, while we did not have any specific instruction from our editorial leadership to report in a particular way, you would from time to time, especially when you were working closely with the president's office, you would get the reminders from time to time that you needed to be careful how you reported about government.
And now, what is the current state of press freedom in Zimbabwe?
I'm in a number of groups, journalism groups with colleagues who are still back home in Zimbabwe. And I would say the space has shrunk even further for journalists in Zimbabwe. In 2017, with the new regime that came in, there was this expectation that there would be press freedom, but we don't see that. And one of the factors that I observe to be particularly challenging for journalists in Zimbabwe is the economic situation, where there is so much poverty, and this is compromising as well how journalists can report on some issues, and it makes them vulnerable. Their integrity is compromised, because sometimes they have to choose between bread and butter, literally, and journalism ethics. So I find that shrinks the space even further for journalists in Zimbabwe.
Are you still working as a journalist, and what are you doing to ensure fair coverage in your country of origin?
I'm not working as a journalist currently, but with the growth that we're seeing in social media, journalism is different now. And I'm very big on social media. I have a Facebook group where I share a lot of information about Zimbabwe with women who live in Canada. And part of the mission with this Facebook group is to get women engaged in economic, social, and political issues, not only in Zimbabwe, but in Canada as well, just to create a space where women are comfortable and they are also appreciative of the diversity of views, trying to cultivate a democratic space. And my hope and my vision is that as we make these changes within this small Facebook group with close to 1,000 women, that this will also propagate into the larger community. And also when women comment and engage outside, they are engaging from a position of knowledge, because what I do is I provide a lot of information. I bring in guest speakers to come and talk about a variety of topics. So you can call that Facebook group a newspaper.
What is your advice to journalists in Zimbabwe and the government?
My advice to journalists would be to be tactful, to be smart, and to also see how they utilize social media and not entirely depend on the mainstream newspapers and the radio and outlets like that. So being creative in how they utilize social media, because at the end of the day, what you want to get out there is information. Social media as well, in as much as it's a useful tool, it also allows for a lot of misinformation. So journalists back home have quite a huge challenge to counter the misinformation and provide correct, accurate, and timely information. So again, just being creative in terms of how they utilize social media, perhaps the names that they use for themselves on social media.
And your advice to the government?
What we have seen with social media, again, is that you cannot suppress the voice of the people. What would be helpful to the government is to be as truthful and as accurate and as quick as possible with information, because over and over again, we are finding that people eventually will get to know the truth of the matter. And government as well can use social media effectively, can work effectively with journalists to communicate their agenda, to also communicate areas where they are challenged so that they can get the support that they need. There has to be mutual respect between journalists and government, because they are both very trusted entities in communities. So government really cannot move forward without working closely with the journalists. It's not an option for them if they are to be successful, particularly as we are faced with the 2023 election. It's important. People love to hear when we tell them that we are struggling. What we know is that people can tell that you are struggling with something, and they just need you to be vulnerable and come clean and say, for example, we're struggling with the issue of the currency in Zimbabwe, and people will understand. We don't need the government to have the answers, but government can use journalists to communicate what struggles they are going through at the moment.